A man sits in a nursing home outside New York City, decades removed from the roar of Madison Square Garden. His hands, which once threw combinations fast enough to end a man's life in a boxing ring, now shake too much to hold a cup of coffee. He cannot always remember what year it is, but there is one thing his mind never lets go of, one memory that surfaces again and again through the fog of dementia. A night in March of 1962, and a man named Benny who never got up. He was a 5-time world champion, one of the most gifted boxers of his generation. And for the rest of his life, he would carry a single question that no championship belt could ever answer. How do you live with a killing the whole world watched and still call yourself a good man? He won titles in 2 different weight divisions, faced the best fighters of his era, and became one of the most decorated champions boxing ever produced. And yet the moment that defined his entire life, the one the newspapers never let him forget, was 10 seconds of violence he never wanted to throw. Number 1. The boy from St. Thomas. Emile Griffith was born on February 3, 1938, on the island of St. Thomas, then part of the U.S. Virgin Islands, one of 8 children. His father left the family when Emile was young. His mother, Imelda, unable to support 8 children on the island, made the difficult decision to leave for New York in search of work, leaving her children behind with relatives. Emile was raised for years by an aunt whose household was strict and, by his own later accounts, at times physically harsh. He grew up without his mother in the room, without his father in the picture, and without much certainty about when, or if, he would ever see either of them again. At age 13, he finally boarded a boat for New York to reunite with his mother, arriving in a city that had nothing in common with the warm, close-knit island streets he'd left behind. He was a quiet, gentle teenager, more interested in avoiding trouble than causing it, with no plan to become a fighter of any kind. That would change because of an ordinary summer job in a building most people would never think twice about walking past. Number 2. The Hat Factory and the Man Who Saw Something. In New York, teenage Emile Griffith took a job at a hat factory owned by a man named Howard Albert, sorting and stacking materials for a modest wage. Albert noticed something almost immediately: the shape of the boy's shoulders, the way his back and arms had built themselves through hard, physical work. Albert happened to also be connected to the boxing world, and he saw in Griffith's build something he recognized instantly: the frame of a natural fighter. He introduced the teenager to a trainer named Gil Clancy, a patient, disciplined coach who would remain in Griffith's corner for the rest of his career. Griffith, by his own admission, had no burning desire to fight anyone. He was mild-mannered, more likely to apologize after a sparring session than boast about it. But Clancy saw raw hand speed and instinct that could not be taught, and he began shaping the shy island kid into a fighter. It was an accidental discovery, a boss noticing a build in a hat factory storeroom that set in motion one of the most complicated careers in the history of the sport. Within a few years, the quiet young man who stacked felt hats for a paycheck would be trading punches for a living, and the world would soon start paying very close attention. Number 3. Golden Gloves and a Fast Rise. Griffith's amateur career moved quickly once Clancy got hold of him. Training out of a gym on the west side of Manhattan, he captured multiple New York Golden Gloves titles within his first 2 years under Clancy's guidance, developing a style built on speed, combinations, and remarkable stamina, closer to a boxer's rhythm than a brawler's power. He turned professional in 1958, and the wins piled up fast against increasingly serious competition. 6 victories in his first year alone, most of them by decision rather than knockout. Griffith was not the kind of fighter who ended nights with a single devastating blow. He was a volume puncher, a fighter who could throw dozens of clean combinations inside a single round and rarely tired before his opponent did, a trait that came directly from the discipline Clancy drilled into him in daily sparring sessions. By 1960, after nearly 24 professional wins against increasingly ranked welterweight competition, Griffith had positioned himself for a shot at the biggest prize of his young career, a fight against the reigning world welterweight champion, a hard-punching Cuban fighter named Benny "Kid" Paret, a former sugarcane cutter who had turned professional at 17. Neither man could have known, when they first stepped into the ring together, how permanently their names would end up bound to each other for the rest of history. Number 4. A champion in New York. On April 1st, 1961, Emile Griffith faced Benny Paret for the first time at Miami Beach and won the welterweight championship of the world by knockout in the 13th round, dropping Paret with a combination that ended the fight before the final bell. He was 23 years old, a Virgin Islands kid who had learned to fight almost by accident, now standing at the top of one of boxing's most competitive divisions, earning a purse of roughly $2,000 for the biggest night of his life to that point. The rematch came just months later, in September of 1961, again in Miami, and this time Paret took the title back on a split decision that many ringside observers, and Griffith himself, believed should have gone the other way, a result that left Griffith publicly frustrated for the first time in his career. The two men were now more than rivals. They were tied together by a trilogy the boxing world could not stop talking about, and a third fight, worth a career-high purse for both men, was already being arranged for the following spring, one that would settle the score in the most devastating way imaginable. Griffith had reached the summit of his sport once already. He was about to climb back toward it one final time, unaware of what waiting there would actually cost him. Number 5. The weight, the toll, the warning signs. Welterweight is one of boxing's most punishing limits to make, a division that forces fighters with naturally larger frames to starve and dehydrate themselves down to 147 pounds before a fight, then rehydrate rapidly once the scale has been satisfied. Griffith, like most welterweights of his era, cut water and food aggressively in the days before a bout, training in heavy layers to sweat down the final pounds, sometimes losing strength and sharpness in the process. His trainer Gil Clancy later admitted that some of Griffith's tougher nights in the ring came directly from a body pushed past what it could comfortably sustain on fight night. By the early 1960s, after dozens of professional fights and years of grueling weight-cutting cycles, the accumulated physical toll was already becoming visible to the people closest to him, even if the wider public only saw a champion at the peak of his powers. Nobody in boxing's medical establishment of that era was tracking what these cycles of starvation, dehydration, and blunt trauma were doing to a fighter's long-term health. Griffith kept making weight. He kept climbing back into the ring. And the sport that was making him famous was about to place him in a spotlight far crueler than any weigh-in scale. Number 6. The system that sold his private life for headlines. In the lead-up to the third Griffith-Paret fight, whispers had followed Griffith for years, questions about his private life, about the fact that he was known to frequent gay bars in New York, at a time when simply being suspected of homosexuality could end a man's career and invite violence. At the official weigh-in on March 24, 1962, in front of reporters, photographers, and a room full of boxing officials, Paret used an anti-gay slur directed at Griffith, mocking him in Spanish in front of the assembled press. The insult was public, deliberate, and humiliating, and it was allowed to happen in a room controlled entirely by the promoters and officials running the event, men who understood perfectly well that controversy sold tickets. Nobody intervened. Nobody protected either fighter from what was, in essence, a promotional stunt dressed up as trash talk. This was the boxing business of the era, functioning exactly as it was built to function, extracting drama from a fighter's most painful vulnerability, because outrage moved seats and moved cameras. Griffith said almost nothing in response that day. He absorbed the insult in silence, in front of a room full of men who profited from his humiliation, and he carried that silence with him into the ring less than 24 hours later. Nobody in that room could have imagined what the combination of a public taunt and a boxing ring would produce by the end of the following night. Number 7. 12 seconds nobody could stop. On March 24, 1962, at Madison Square Garden, Griffith and Paret fought for the third and final time, with cameras rolling for a national television broadcast. The fight was close through most of its length. Then, in the 12th round, Griffith trapped Paret against the ropes in the corner and unleashed a rapid, sustained barrage of unanswered punches, somewhere between 17 and 29 blows by different counts, delivered in a span of only a few seconds. Paret's body sagged against the ropes, held upright by the ring post itself, unable to fall, unable to defend. The referee, Ruby Goldstein, later admitted he froze for several critical seconds before finally stepping in to stop the fight. Paret collapsed and never regained consciousness. He was carried from the ring on a stretcher, fell into a coma, and died 10 days later, on April 3, 1962, at the age of 25. The fight had been broadcast live on national television, watched by millions of American households, and the death of Benny Paret became one of the most publicly witnessed tragedies in the history of American sports. Boxing commissions across the country came under intense scrutiny. Several networks pulled back from broadcasting live fights for years afterward, and Emile Griffith, the man who had thrown the punches, walked out of Madison Square Garden that night, carrying a weight that no championship belt would ever be heavy enough to balance. Number 8. The years the game never let him rest. Griffith did not retire after Paret's death. He kept fighting, in part because it was the only trade he knew, and went on to become one of the most accomplished champions of his generation, winning the world welterweight and middleweight titles a combined 5 times across a career that stretched over 85 professional fights. But those who knew him described a man permanently changed, someone who woke from nightmares about the 12th round for years afterward, who reportedly said in interviews that he thought about Benny Paret every single day of his life. The violence that had built his career had also broken something inside him that never fully healed. Then, in 1992, 30 years after the fight that made his name infamous, Griffith was leaving a gay bar in New York City when he was ambushed and beaten by a group of men who had targeted him specifically because of his sexuality. He suffered severe injuries in the attack, including damage that friends and family believed accelerated the neurological decline that followed him into his final years. By the early 2000s, Griffith was showing unmistakable signs of dementia pugilistica, the same punch-accumulated brain disease that had quietly destroyed so many fighters of his generation, a disease that no doctor in his prime had ever warned him about, because the sport itself had never bothered to study it. His adopted son, Luis Rodrigo Griffith, became his full-time caretaker, managing a man who had once been fast enough and precise enough to end a life in 12 seconds, and could no longer remember, on his worst days, his own name. Number 9. 2 men bound by one night. Emile Griffith died on July 23, 2013, in a nursing home in Hempstead, New York, from complications tied to kidney failure and the long deterioration of dementia pugilistica. He was 75 years old. But the final chapter of his story is not about his death. Years earlier, in an act that stunned people who knew the history between the two families, Griffith had reached out to Benny Paret Jr., the son who had been an infant when his father died in that ring. The two men met, spoke, and over time built an unlikely friendship, a relationship rooted in shared grief rather than blame. Paret's son later said publicly that he did not hold Griffith responsible for what happened that night, that he understood his father died doing the job he loved, inside a system that had failed both men equally. Boxing historians who studied Griffith's life point to the same conclusion, that the sport, the promoters, and the culture surrounding it had manufactured a moment of public humiliation and then placed both fighters inside a ring built for exactly the kind of violence that followed. In 1990, Griffith was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame, honored for a career that produced 5 world championships across 2 weight classes. But the record books could never capture what he carried for 51 years after that night at Madison Square Garden. He won more titles than almost anyone of his era, and still spent the rest of his life answering for 10 seconds he never wanted to throw. He climbed to the very top of his sport twice, in 2 different weight classes, and still spent every year that followed carrying a death he never intended and a secret the public was never supposed to punish him for. If Emile Griffith's story stayed with you, subscribe. There are more legends whose real stories deserve to be told. And tell us in the comments, do you think boxing's culture and the men who profited from that weigh-in share the blame for what happened in that ring?